A year ago, my life completely fell apart, and I need to get this off my chest. I never imagined I'd be sharing something so personal online, but here I am. When your family turns against you and you're left standing there wondering, how did this even happen? Sometimes you just have to tell the whole story. Let me start from the beginning, because this is one of those situations where you can't help but think, seriously, what the hell? My friend Dave has a sister named Jenny. We've all known each other for years, having grown up in the same neighborhood. Sometimes we hung out, but nothing significant. Jenny was always a bit different. I don't mean to sound harsh, but she struggled with some mental health issues. I didn't know the specifics because it wasn't my business, and Dave never really talked about it. Still, everyone around knew she had her struggles. Out of nowhere, about a year ago, Jenny reached out to me with news that she was pregnant. At first I thought, okay, good for her, but then she hit me with a bombshell. She claimed I was the father. I swear my brain short-circuited. I was completely floored because, to be absolutely clear, I've never even hugged Jenny, let alone been intimate with her. Not once. I told her directly, Jenny, I have no idea what you're talking about. There's no way I'm the father. We've never had that kind of relationship. But she kept repeating it like she thought she could convince me of something that never happened. It was so bizarre, I didn't know how to process it. I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe this was related to her mental health challenges, but I was freaking out inside. Things only got worse when she flat out refused to take a prenatal paternity test. I remember thinking, if you're so sure it's my child, why not take the test and prove it? But she wouldn't budge. Instead, she guilt-tripped me, saying things like, you're abandoning us before the baby's even born, and trying to make me feel like the worst person alive. I wasn't buying it. I told her I wasn't going to sign anything or take responsibility for a child without proof. I thought that would be the end of it, but oh, how wrong I was. The real nightmare started when my parents found out. I love my parents, but they have these strict traditional values. The second they heard about the situation, they completely lost it. They called me a deadbeat, a disgrace, and worse. I tried to explain, Mom, Dad, this isn't my child. Jenny's making this up. But they refused to listen. It didn't matter how much I insisted, I was guilty in their eyes. Arguments broke out, and things were said that couldn't be taken back. My parents kept pushing me to do the right thing and step up, even though I kept telling them the baby wasn't mine. Here's the craziest part. I wasn't even in the same state when Jenny would have conceived. She was staying with a friend for an entire month during the supposed timeline. I pointed this out to my parents, but they dismissed it, saying, people make mistakes. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate accusation that could ruin my life. By the 6th month of Jenny's pregnancy, my entire family had turned against me. Every family dinner, every phone call, every text revolved around how I needed to take responsibility. Even a couple of my friends started doubting me, asking, are you sure, man? Maybe you forgot something. I was losing my mind. Then my parents gave me an ultimatum. Either act like the father or be cut out of the family. At first I thought they were bluffing, but they weren't. When I stood my ground, they disowned me. It hurt more than I can put into words. These were the people who raised me, and they believed someone else's lie over me. They cast me aside as if I didn't matter. Things got even stranger after the baby was born. My mom was there at the hospital, proudly playing the role of grandma. I didn't even know until later. Jenny still refused to take a paternity test, so I had to go through legal channels to get one. When the results finally came back, it was exactly what I knew all along. 0% chance I was the father. I can't even describe the mix of relief and anger I felt in that moment. I immediately sent the results to my parents, thinking they'd finally believe me, and things would go back to normal. But instead of apologizing outright, they started bombarding me with calls and texts. They begged for forgiveness and even offered me money. My dad sent a few $100s in the mail, like that would make everything better. I kept the money because, frankly, I felt like they owed me for everything they'd put me through. But forgiveness? No. I made it clear that if they were so willing to disown me over a lie, I wasn't going to risk that kind of betrayal again. Most of my friends stood by me, but a few, along with my therapist, began saying things like, Maybe you should give your parents another chance. They're your family after all. I understood where they were coming from, I really did. But how do you forgive people who were so quick to discard you? How do you rebuild trust with someone who believed lies about you over their own child? That's where I'm stuck now, caught between knowing I didn't do anything wrong and wondering if it's worth trying to mend things with my family. But every time I think about it, I remember how fast they turned their backs on me, and I can't ignore how deeply they let me down when I needed them most. After everything that went down with my parents and the chaos surrounding Jenny's baby drama, you'd think things would settle down, right? Wrong. If anything, the situation just got worse. You'd assume that proving I wasn't the father would finally put an end to the madness, but I wish it were that simple. When people refuse to own up to their mistakes, they'll go to great lengths to avoid taking responsibility. After the paternity test results came back confirming I wasn't the father, I thought, finally my parents will see the truth, and we can move forward. But instead of the relief I hoped for, things only became more complicated. For starters, Jenny completely lost it. She started spreading rumors around town, claiming I'd faked the test or tampered with the results. Yes, you read that correctly. She actually believed I somehow convinced an entire lab to falsify DNA evidence in my favor. How would I even pull that off? I'm just a regular guy, not some genius who knows how to manipulate test results. But Jenny didn't care. In her mind, I was the villain, and she was determined to make others see me that way. She went around telling people I had abandoned her and the baby, accusing me of tricking everyone into thinking I wasn't the father. None of it made sense, but that didn't matter. Rumors in a small town spread like wildfire. Soon, I had strangers giving me judgmental looks at the grocery store like I was some kind of monster. Some even confronted me directly, demanding to know why I wasn't taking responsibility for my child. It was beyond frustrating. I had official test results proving I wasn't the dad, but nobody seemed to care. Jenny played the victim perfectly, and I was stuck being painted as the bad guy. I'd never felt so powerless in my entire life. It's one thing for your own family to betray you, but having an entire town see you as the villain? That's a whole different kind of pain. My parents, meanwhile, were still trying to act like everything was fine. My mom left me long, emotional voicemails about how she wanted our family to be whole again, never acknowledging the hurt they'd caused. She suggested I come over for dinner, as though sitting at the table together would magically fix everything. It wasn't just awkward, it was insulting. After all the damage they'd done, they thought a few meals and forced smiles would erase it all. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of their mistakes, just an expectation to move on, as if nothing had happened. But trust doesn't work that way. When it's broken so completely, it can't be repaired with a quick fix. It requires real effort and accountability, neither of which my parents were willing to show. The breaking point came when my dad tried to bribe me. He actually sent me an email offering to buy me a new car if I would reconcile with the family. I couldn't believe it. Did they honestly think they could buy my forgiveness? I stared at the email for a long time, wondering if it was some kind of cruel joke. But no, he was serious. I didn't respond. What could I even say? It was clear they weren't interested in fixing things the right way. They just wanted me back in their lives for their convenience. The fact that they thought money could solve everything made me realize how little they understood the gravity of what they'd done. The final straw came when Jenny started dragging people I knew into her mess. She even contacted my ex-girlfriend Samantha, trying to convince her I was a terrible person who abandoned his child. Sam and I hadn't spoken in years, but out of nowhere I got a text from her saying we needed to talk. At first I was confused, but then she explained that Jenny had been messaging her and stirring up old drama. I was furious. I called Jenny and told her to stop, that I was done with the lies and manipulation, and that I wasn't going to let her involve my friends or exes in her games. She just laughed and hung up. Talking to her was like hitting a brick wall. She was so consumed by her fantasy that nothing I said could break through. At this point, I seriously considered hiring a lawyer. I didn't want to escalate things that far, but what other choice did I have? Jenny was out there trashing my reputation. My parents were enabling her behavior, and I felt completely alone. Sure, my closest friends supported me, but even they didn't fully grasp how bad things had become. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, waiting for the next rumor or accusation. I decided to cut ties entirely, not just with Jenny, but with my parents too. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. I wrote my parents a long email explaining everything, how deeply they'd hurt me, how betrayed I felt, and how I couldn't trust them anymore. I didn't hold back. I told them I wasn't ready to forgive them and didn't know if I ever would. If they wanted any chance of rebuilding a relationship with me, they'd have to start by apologizing and taking full responsibility for their actions. No more pretending everything was fine. No more sweeping things under the rug. As for Jenny, I blocked her on every platform. I couldn't deal with her manipulations any longer. She wasn't my responsibility, and I refused to let her drag me down any further. I even had to tell Dave, Jenny's brother, that I couldn't be around his family for a while. That conversation was tough because Dave has always been a good friend, but I had to prioritize my own well-being. It's been a few months since I cut ties with them, and honestly, it's been a huge relief. Sure, there are moments when I feel guilty or start doubting my decision, but deep down, I know it was the right choice. Sometimes you just have to step away, even when it's painful. It's messy and far from simple, but at least now I'm not constantly on edge, bracing for the next disaster. For the first time in a long while, I can actually breathe again. Still, if you'd told me a year ago that I'd end up here, I never would have believed it. Life is strange like that, I guess. Update 1. So here's where things get even stranger. I thought that cutting off contact with Jenny and my parents would put an end to the chaos. I assumed that once they were out of my life, things would finally calm down and I could move forward. But of course, nothing ever works out that easily. Cutting ties with them was just the beginning of a whole new set of problems. A couple of weeks after I sent the email to my parents and blocked Jenny, I received an unexpected message from Mike, an old high school friend. We hadn't spoken in years, so his reaching out was completely out of the blue. At first I thought it was random, but then he told me that my parents had contacted him. Now, Mike and I weren't even that close back in the day, so for my parents to reach out to him was a massive red flag. Apparently they had been going around trying to convince people to speak to me on their behalf. They were contacting old friends, distant relatives, and even acquaintances I barely knew. My parents were telling everyone that I was in a bad place and that they were deeply concerned about me. It was as if they were trying to portray me as the unstable one. To make matters worse, they framed the situation to make it seem like I was the one who owed them an apology for cutting them off. Thankfully, Mike saw through their act and wanted to warn me about what was happening. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I started getting messages from all kinds of people. Some I hadn't spoken to in years, others I'd only met briefly. They all echoed the same sentiments. Your parents are so worried about you. Or, maybe you should give them another chance. It was unbelievable. My parents had somehow convinced all these people that I was the bad guy, that I had gone off the rails, and that I needed to make things right. Here I was just trying to move on with my life, and they were running a full-blown smear campaign against me. It felt like I was living in an alternate reality where nothing made sense. No matter how hard I tried to stay out of the drama, it kept finding its way back into my life. The breaking point came when my parents crossed a line I never expected. They contacted my workplace. Yes, they actually reached out to my boss. I have no idea how they got his contact information, but somehow they managed to track it down and call the office. They told him they were concerned about me and that I wasn't in a good mental state. You can imagine how mortifying this was. One day my boss pulled me aside into his office looking serious and asked if everything was okay at home. I was stunned and didn't know what to say at first. How do you even respond when your boss is questioning you because of your parents? I explained the entire situation to him, and thankfully he was understanding. He even apologized for bringing it up. But the damage was already done. My parents had taken things to a new level by trying to interfere with my job. After that, I had no choice but to take legal action. I reached out to a lawyer and began the process of obtaining a restraining order. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I had to protect myself. My parents were interfering with my career, my friendships, and my peace of mind. It was time to draw a line. The process was long and emotionally draining. Between the court hearings, the paperwork, and the constant anxiety, it was overwhelming. But at the same time, I felt a sense of empowerment. For the first time, I was taking control of the situation and setting boundaries. No more letting them invade every corner of my life or twist the narrative to suit their agenda. When my parents found out about the restraining order, all hell broke loose. My mom sent me an emotional, guilt-filled email saying she never imagined her own son would do something like this. She went on about how family is supposed to stick together no matter what, claiming I was the one tearing us apart and causing pain. It was classic manipulation, but I didn't take the bait. I didn't even respond. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but things only got worse before they got better. One day I came home from work to find my car had been vandalized. Someone had keyed the word liar into the side of it. I didn't have any proof that my parents were responsible, but let's be real. Who else would have done it? I hadn't told anyone about the restraining order except a few close friends. My parents were the only ones with a motive to pull something like this. I filed a police report, but nothing ever came of it. It was just another painful reminder that the people who are supposed to love you the most can sometimes hurt you the worst. After that, I started parking my car at a friend's house to keep it safe. I even installed security cameras around my apartment just in case. It felt like I was living in constant paranoia, always bracing for the next attack. But eventually, things began to settle down. The restraining order was finalized, officially barring my parents from contacting me or coming near my home or workplace. It was like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could finally breathe again. It's been a few months since then, and I'm still trying to pick up the pieces. I had to explain the entire situation to my friends and co-workers, making sure they understood the truth. Most of them were supportive, but a few were skeptical. They couldn't believe my parents would go to such extremes. I get it. It sounds unbelievable. But when you've lived through it, you understand how far people will go when they feel like they're losing control. Looking back, I never thought things would get this bad. It's shocking how quickly family can turn on you when you refuse to follow their rules. But if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you can't let anyone, not even your family, dictate how you live your life. Sometimes walking away is the only choice, even if it's painful. I don't know what the future holds for me and my parents. Maybe someday they'll realize what they've done and offer a genuine apology. Maybe they won't. Either way, I'm done letting them control my life. I've chosen my own path, and I'm not turning back. Update 2. Things took another turn after I finally secured the restraining order and started trying to rebuild my life. I thought everything would settle down at last, but life had other plans. Just as I was beginning to feel some relief and regain a sense of normalcy, my parents found a new way to cause trouble. This time it wasn't through direct contact, vandalizing my car or sending guilt-ridden emails. No, this was a whole new level of outrageous. One day I was at home minding my own business when I received a letter in the mail. At first, nothing seemed unusual. It's not uncommon to get mail. But as I opened it, I realized it was from a lawyer. My initial thought was that it might be related to the restraining order, perhaps some final paperwork to wrap things up. However, I was completely wrong. It wasn't about that at all. It was a lawsuit. My own parents were suing me. And for what, you ask? Emotional distress. I could hardly believe the words I was reading. They claimed that by cutting them out of my life, I had caused them severe emotional suffering and that they were entitled to compensation. They even accused me of alienating them from the rest of the family. The audacity of it all was overwhelming, especially since they were the ones who had isolated me in the first place. I sat there for what felt like forever, just staring at the letter in disbelief. I mean, who sues their child because they're upset about being cut off? It was absurd. Part of me wanted to laugh at how ridiculous it was, but another part of me felt deeply stressed. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was a legal battle, and it was about to get messy. I immediately contacted my lawyer, who was as shocked as I was. She had handled her fair share of complicated family disputes, but suing your own child for emotional distress was a first even for her. As we reviewed the lawsuit, it became clear that most of their claims were baseless. However, we couldn't just dismiss it outright. They were serious, and that meant I had to take it seriously too. The following weeks were a whirlwind of stress, meetings, and phone calls. I had to collect every piece of evidence I could: paternity test results, the restraining order, and records of the harassment I had endured. My lawyer was confident we could win, but the entire ordeal felt surreal. The fact that my own parents were dragging me to court simply because I refused to let them control me anymore was mind-boggling. But it didn't end there. My parents decided to escalate things further. They began contacting other family members to turn them against me. Soon, I started receiving messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in years. They all said the same things. "Why can't you just make peace with your parents?" Or, "Family is everything, you're being selfish." It was infuriating. It felt like my parents had brainwashed everyone into believing their side of the story, painting me as the villain. I was angry, not just at my parents, but at the entire situation. It seemed no matter what I did to protect myself, they found ways to twist the narrative and make me look like the bad guy. How do you explain to people who only hear one side of the story that your parents are suing you for emotional distress because you set boundaries? It became exhausting trying to justify my actions to people who had already made up their minds. Eventually, I had to cut ties with even more people. I blocked family members, unfriended acquaintances on social media, and distanced myself completely. It wasn't because I didn't care about them, I did, but I couldn't keep having the same conversation with people unwilling to see the bigger picture. Finally, the court date arrived. I showed up with my lawyer, prepared for whatever nonsense my parents had planned. The entire thing was a spectacle. My parents had concocted a sob story about how they'd always supported me, tried to help me during tough times, and how I had cruelly cut them off for no reason. They presented themselves as the victims, which was almost impressive considering they were the ones who disowned me in the first place. But my lawyer wasn't having it. She meticulously dismantled their claims, presenting all the evidence we had: the harassment, the restraining order, the paternity test, and more. It was brutal, and by the end it was clear the judge wasn't buying their story. The judge ruled in my favor, dismissing the lawsuit and ordering my parents to pay my legal fees. It was a small victory, but in the grand scheme of things, it didn't feel like much. I had escaped the nightmare, but there was still so much fallout to deal with. After the case, my parents made one last attempt to worm their way back into my life. They sent me a long letter apologizing for everything, claiming they wanted to make things right and couldn't bear the thought of losing me. It was the same guilt-tripping tactics they'd been using all along, and I didn't even bother responding. I had already made my decision. There's only so much someone can take before they have to walk away for good. Cutting ties with your family is never easy, no matter how toxic things get. But sometimes it's the only way to protect your sanity. I couldn't let them continue dragging me into their chaos, no matter how much they claimed to love me. Their version of love was harmful, and I wasn't going to let it ruin my life anymore. So that's where things stand now. The lawsuit is behind me, the restraining order remains in place, and I'm focusing on moving forward. It hasn't been easy, but I'm finally learning how to live without all the noise and constant stress of wondering what disaster might come next. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have control over my own life, and that feels incredible. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day things will change, or maybe they won't. But for now, I'm focusing on rebuilding the parts of my life they tried to tear apart. It's been a long road, but I'm starting to see light at the end of the tunnel. Update 3. If you've been following my story, you'd think that after the lawsuit and the restraining order, the drama would finally be over. But of course, my family found a way to surprise me one more time. And this time, it was so low that I couldn't help but shake my head in disbelief. A few months after the court ruled in my favor, things were finally starting to settle down. I had cut ties with everyone causing me stress, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could focus on rebuilding my life. No random messages from old friends, no legal letters, just peace. Or so I thought. One day, I was out running errands, doing normal things like grocery shopping, when I bumped into my cousin Melissa. We were never particularly close, but we'd always gotten along. I figured there was no harm in saying hello, so we started chatting. At first, the conversation was light, just catching up on life, work, and the usual stuff. But then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Hey, did you hear what your parents are planning?" I froze, my mind racing as that familiar sinking feeling hit me. Melissa looked hesitant, almost as though she wasn't sure she should be sharing this with me. After a moment, she sighed and continued, "Yeah, they're organizing a big family reunion next month. Apparently, they've been telling everyone it's supposed to be a reconciliation thing between you and them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents were actually planning an ambush-style reunion to pressure me back into the family. I asked Melissa for more details, and she explained that they'd invited everyone, distant relatives, family friends, and even people I hadn't seen in ages. The worst part, they were telling everyone that I'd be there, acting as if I was fully on board with the whole idea. I was livid. I hadn't agreed to anything, yet they were setting me up to look like the bad guy if I didn't show up. It was classic behavior from my parents: manipulate the situation, make me seem like the villain, and guilt-trip me into doing what they wanted. I thanked Melissa for the heads-up and told her flat out that I wasn't going. She seemed to understand, but I could tell she was conflicted. It was clear that even she was starting to buy into my parents' narrative of, "We just want to fix things." I could see it in her expression. She wanted me to go to somehow make things right, but after everything my parents had put me through, there was no chance I'd walk into that trap. That night I spent a long time thinking about what to do. I was certain I wouldn't attend the reunion, but I felt like I needed to address the situation. Ignoring it didn't feel right. The next morning, I sat down and wrote my parents an email. It wasn't lengthy, but it was straightforward. I told them I knew about the reunion and that I wouldn't be attending. I made it clear that I wanted no part in a reconciliation that was being forced on me, especially not in front of a crowd. I also explained that if they truly cared about repairing our relationship, the first step would be respecting my boundaries. Until they could do that, there was nothing more to discuss. I didn't expect a reply, and honestly, I didn't need one. I just wanted to set the record straight one final time. But of course, my parents couldn't let it go. A few days later, my dad called me. I didn't answer, but he left a long voicemail filled with rambling about how I was tearing the family apart and how the reunion was supposed to be a fresh start for all of us. He even tried to guilt-trip me, saying, "Your grandparents would be so disappointed in how you're handling this." That voicemail hit me, not because I believed him, but because it reminded me of all the times my parents had used guilt and manipulation to get their way. They were willing to exploit any angle to make me feel like the problem, even dragging my grandparents into it, people who had always supported me. It was a classic move, designed to shift the blame and avoid accountability. But I didn't respond. What was the point? I'd already made my stance clear, and I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their drama. Still, the whole situation weighed on me for days. I kept thinking about the reunion and all the relatives who would be there, assuming I was refusing to make peace. I wondered how many of them actually knew the truth and how many had been fed the twisted version my parents were spinning. The reunion eventually came and went, and I didn't hear a word from my parents afterward. I saw some photos on Facebook. Happy faces, hugs, and smiles. My parents were there, acting as though everything was fine, like they hadn't spent the past year actively trying to ruin my life. It was strange to see them pretending everything was perfect. But then again, that was something they'd always been good at. Pretending. A few weeks later, I ran into Melissa again. She told me the reunion had been awkward. Apparently, a lot of people had expected me to show up, and when I didn't, it led to some uncomfortable conversations. My parents tried to explain my absence, but from what Melissa said, their excuses didn't go over well. A few relatives even started questioning why I wasn't there and why my parents hadn't been more honest about the situation. It was a small comfort to know that not everyone was buying their story. And that's where things stand now. I've managed to put some distance between myself and the drama, but I know it's still lingering beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. My parents will probably never admit they were in the wrong, and I've come to accept that I can't change them. What I can do, though, is protect myself. I'm focusing on building a life free from their influence and prioritizing relationships with people who truly care about me. It's been a long journey, and I won't lie, it still hurts sometimes. Cutting ties with family is never easy, and there are moments when I wonder if I made the right choice. But deep down, I know it was necessary. I had to put my mental health, my peace, and my future above the toxic cycle they kept pulling me into. So that's where I am now. Maybe one day things will change, or maybe they won't. Either way, I'm done letting my family dictate how I live my life. I've chosen my own path, and for the first time in a long while, I'm walking it on my own terms.